been for you since around money?
The meetings all week. Well, we may have just gone live because I hit a button that said go live, and maybe we were before. But anyway, those conversations have been amazing. We call them Current 5 at 5 talks, and each day this week at 5 p.m. we've covered a different topic. And so hopefully some of you have been able to see those shows. We've heard great feedback. Our first guest on Monday was Heinz Hoffner in Germany. He's a brilliant economist who's a real specialist in community currencies and the definition of money. So we covered what is money. And then on Tuesday, we covered the evolution of currency with Martin and Tamika Dunkley from Seasoned Delicious. And each conversation is so deep and enriching and lively that I feel like it's a great component of this show, Livelihood News, which we're doing every Friday at 2. And so this week we just wanted to have a little bit of knowledge added to the wisdom chest and have done a talk every day at 5. Wednesday was with Shaniqua Bowden from the Kingston Land Trust, and we covered dollars and inequality. Yesterday we discussed universal basic income with Assemblyman Ron Kim, a representative from Senator Julia Salazar's office, and Hudson Valley Current Board President David McCarthy. We had a great discussion about UBI and the fact that we like a term better that we came up with. Kevius and I have been talking about a reciprocal regenerative income. And then today at 5 p.m. in about 3 hours, we'll be talking with Dr. Leanne Usher about the current community protection plan. So Kevius, what were your thoughts about the video clips and the highlights?
Yeah, we've got some amazing highlights lined up for you all. We're going to set them live Monday, including the 5 for 5 that we're going to record today at 5. Just some of those highlighting moments, really highlighting, you know, what we aim to achieve during those conversations is answering those big questions. So for Monday, we'll answer the question, what is money, with Heinz Hoffner. Tuesday, we will talk about the evolution of currency. Wednesday, we will talk about everything. Just be some highlighting moments for us. So Chris, I want to bag the conversation up and just go day by day on what we've learned each day and what we take into the next day and how it all ties into what we propose as a CCPP. So starting with Monday and our amazing conversation with Heinz, what is money? What's the role of money? Why is money important? And why was money created? Like, what is money?
Well, I think two highlights that I'm thinking of were when we pulled up the definition of money and had the discussion that there are people like Dr. Leander Bindewald, who did his whole doctoral research around the definition of currency and money and found that even regulators and creators of money have a hard time defining it. So we looked up the definition and it says a current medium of exchange that uses coins and banknotes. And so right away we were able to digest that definition, and we love that it says current in it because we run the Hudson Valley Current, but it's talking about being modern. It has to be used today. It has to be usable in our society today if it's money. But then we started digging a little deeper. Current medium of exchange. Okay, medium of exchange is great. But using banknotes and coins, only 2% of dollars are actual physical banknotes and coins. So we started discussing, well, if it's mostly digital, 98%, then what is money? How do we go deeper into that definition? And, you know, because you're studying economics and also are a very deep thinker around money, we know there's different definitions, like it's a store of value. If I work an hour, it stores that value in money. So I can then use that hour stored in money to go buy food. That was one highlight, and I'll get back to my second one after you either follow up or share a highlight.
Yeah, so you're touching on when you said modern money, is that now we're looking at money and our understanding of money as a ledger, right? It's like I go to a negative amount, you go to a positive amount, but I think what gets lost there is that money is set to assign value to certain things, and then we create a society and a system of exchange to exchange those values. you know, to say, hey, I am losing value, so you gain value, and vice versa. And it ties into this idea that we talked about of reciprocity, and that, you know, any economy or economics as a social science is built on the idea of reciprocity, because it takes social beings in order to make it happen. Um, and I kind of want to go into the point of, when we're talking about money in the local currency, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this segment today, when we talk about the evolution of currency, is how important is reciprocity in any economy, or any economy, barter system, system of exchange, or any system where we're transferring value. Why is reciprocity so important?
Well, that's an interesting question, because we were in a meeting with Dr. Leanne Usher earlier today discussing food security in a food desert in Kingston known as Pankaki. It's on the waterfront, and a horrible both urban renewal, quote, or urban removal program, and a highway that was associated with it made Pankaki a food desert and a cutoff location of Kingston. And so she was talking about the reciprocity of value of people, and how one thing we forget to realize, especially with the community currency that we know is coming back around, is spending is powerful and important. We're usually like, oh, I got to pay a bill. I'm going to lose 20 bucks on this one, you know. But when we see that, when we spend it at the local store on the corner, and then they pay someone, and that person is a babysitter, and you pay that person, and that money starts moving through the community, that $20 is coming back to you soon. But when dollars constantly leave our community, it's hard to picture that relationship. And so that's why it's fun to work with Dr. Usher and you, and people who like to map the way money moves and value moves.
And I think, yeah, you just picked on that topic of reciprocity like right on the nose. It's this idea of containing and retaining value, you know, and I think that's what we're witnessing with the current. But before we get into complementary currencies, is, you know, let's take, we know what money is, right? We've come to this conclusion that money is a way for us to transfer value between each other, to get the resources we need. However, you know, from the beginning of time, you know, when money was created, we get this idea of the need for complementary currency. And that goes into when reciprocity isn't isn't in play within a region, like where money cannot be retained. So we talked about on the evolution of currency, you know, old government in Egypt, the first complementary currency was put into place because their residents couldn't, you know, they couldn't get the currency to buy the resources so they need. So they introduced a complementary currency, which mirrored their local currency, their national currency, in order to get the residents the currency they need. And I think this is something that we're seeing in the Hudson Valley, and namely in Kingston right now, where value cannot be retained, where that reciprocity cannot happen, because we have, you know, secondary sources that are pulling that value out, whether they're commercial grocery stores, whether they're just predatory loans, you know. So I kind of want to talk about, where did you see the need for a complementary currency in Kingston? Because I think we're witnessing the evolution of currency right now. So yeah, just the need for the currency.
I think the cool thing is we're always witnessing an evolution of currency. And so the word that I think is very important that you just said is complementary, because the goal of a local currency is to complement the national currency. Even in the example you just used about Egypt. Another example during the Great Depression was the Veer Bank that started in 1934, and it still exists in Switzerland, and it helped them quickly get out of the depression. And so I saw an article recently about how community currencies could help prop up the Federal Reserve, and vice versa. We're seeing federal programs, we're seeing state programs, and now we're seeing very local programs down to the mutual aid level, where it's just humans caring about each other. And so our guest on Monday, Heinz Hoffner, is working on reinvigorating a local currency that started during the Great Depression called the Virgl, WORGLL, in Austria. And the guy, Unter Guggenberger, who created it, had this lovely, back then they also called it script, especially in the US. There were a lot of scripts that popped up, and they were usually corporate backed, where a company would say, you know, I can't afford to pay anyone, but keep working, I'll give you this thing. I swear it's worth something. Just bring this to the store later and it'll be worth something. And that was called script. But in Austria, they created the Virgil, and it made that town of Virgil very successful very quickly. And they were springing back from the Depression. And then suddenly the federal government, the national government came in and shut it down and said it's unfair for them to thrive like that while the rest of the country suffers. Where if they had thought in the reverse, like, which is a goal of the Hudson Valley Current and our work here in the Hudson Valley, how do we strengthen our whole country? COVID has pointed out something amazing. So every viewer, whether you're in New York or California or somewhere else in the world, is being affected by the economic impacts of COVID. So we can all relate to the fact that an evolution of currency makes sense. We see mutual aid springing up. We see bartering springing up. Things that are as old as time suddenly become important. Oh, there's a great saying, and maybe you've heard this in economics classes. The fish don't question the water they swim in until it's poison. Why would you? It's just water, it makes sense. But if it's poison, you start saying, what is this that's making me sick every day? And so that's when you get to the basics of what money is. I love it, because then Heinz got even deeper later when we talked about World War II.
You're touching on something really, really deep here, still on the topic of reciprocity, but that need for, when you said mutual aid, and I want to tie that into COVID, because we're witnessing a time where everyone is getting hit, equally as hard. However, everyone is not equally as impacted. And I think I want to touch on our shared knowledge. Even if we go back to the history of World War I and II, if we want to, but also talk about that into the Great Depression and how our country is built on that inequality. As we talk about the evolution of currency and make our way into dollars and inequality. What about the dollar makes us so unequal? Because one thing that you mentioned was that before, there's kind of like the government came in and said, hey, you cannot thrive off of this system while other people suffer. And I think it's interesting because as I was watching the Lost Roundout, which was about the Pakaki neighborhood and the Roundout district, they developed a system of IOUs, and that's how they sustained themselves. And then the government came in and said, hey, you can't do that, And then we saw the removal and the neglection of such communities. So
because some people will define money as an IOU, even a dollar bill, they'll call that an IOU. So go on.
Yeah, so I just want to know, going forward, is how does the Current align with that idea of IOU in a way to strengthen the local community? And what about the Current makes it different, where folks where everyone starts on the equal playing field and there's no, advantages or imposed inequality?
Well, one thing that we started saying maybe about 8 months ago is that the Hudson Valley Current is helping to shift the narrative around our relationship with capital. And so I guess that relates to your question, because we don't know what money is. And when we start to discuss it and say that even the Federal Reserve calls a dollar a credit, when they talk about it, it's called a credit. So 1 unit of anything that's exchanged for something becomes money. So what we're doing is helping us as a community and our nation, and hopefully the world as we grow. And there's a movement, there's a global movement about community currencies. And when I traveled to places like Japan last year, I learned more than I've learned in 10 years of doing this research sometimes, and make connections like meeting Heinz Hoffner, our guest on Monday, who opened my eyes to money in a new way. Like he said, you have a food truck and you accept local currency? Don't take dollars. If people come to the window, you say, no, we don't take those. We only take currents. That's a choice of ours that we have as a community currency. And even you as a member, or any member using, or anyone with a profile using currents, could choose to get creative like that. But on the flip side, we see on our dollars, it says this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. That means you have to accept it. You have to accept it. If someone offers you that money as payment in this country, legal tender is required to be accepted. If I want to pay you 20 currents for something, Kivius, you don't have to accept it. But you can get creative and say at the food truck, no, we don't take dollars, we take currents. And if they don't have currents, then it becomes an educational thing. Well, what are currents? How do I get them? They seem interesting, you know, and now people are thinking about time banks. What's a time bank and how is that different than a mutual credit system? And how is that different than, let's say, the Berkshires, which you can convert dollars to that local currency? And how is that different than the wampum that the Native Americans on Long Island used as currency? Great questions, and they're partly rhetorical.
Yeah, and I think that that really touches on the inequality in a sense, and what separates the current is, one thing that I really love about the current is this 300 current line of trust, right? And the fact that, when you sign up, you can get it. However, you have to work for it, is uniting everyone in that sense. And I remember when we were talking to Tamika and Martin Dunkley, and they were talking about their decision to accept currents, is that there is a knowledge that comes behind your food, there's a knowledge that comes behind your products because it's local, because the people that are doing it, and that the people are being paid their actual value for their product. So Chris, another thing that creates inequality and further extracts value from our system are those government subsidies that are imposed in the way we consume food and the way we purchase products. So can you talk a little bit about that and how the current aims to actually pay people their value for their products and service?
Sure, yeah. I think most of our job, and my job in particular for the last 7 to 10 years, we got the first current flowing in 2013. We've been working on this with different passionate people since 2010. And I think you mentioned monopolies earlier and the amassing of wealth, and the fact that sometimes the government steps in and says that's unfair. You own all the railroad companies plus all of the fuel and coal companies. It seems a little unfair that you've cornered the market on everything. But we've got that again. The acts that were created at the turn of the 20th century to outlaw monopolies, suddenly we have companies like News Corp that owns thousands of media stations, and CBS is owned by Disney, and just the overlap of corporatization of America is very interesting. So we have lasting wealth from that monopoly time that still has generational wealth in today. And so the cool thing about the current is you can't take that old monopoly wealth, for example, or wealth that you got from poisoning the earth on extractive techniques for mining, and turn that into currents. Everyone earns currents the same way, whether you're struggling to succeed and just need a little bit of support from a friend in the community, or whether you are a billionaire, you earn a current the same way. And that's exciting. And it's almost like how a time bank, everyone's hour has to be worth the same. In the current, everyone's hour doesn't have to be worth the same. In a time bank, a babysitter's hour is traded for a doctor's hour at the same level. They contribute that to a time bank. And because of that really, really beautiful connection and kind-hearted openness about each other, the IRS doesn't tax time banks. It's a non-taxable exchange system. But because you can determine value in the current, just like with the dollar, if I charge $20 an hour for something, I could charge 20 currents an hour, but you could charge 80 currents an hour if you want. You choose your value and your rate. And so everyone gets an equal playing field in the current to earn at the same rate, and not the same rate, the same methods. And that means we all start to learn about each other's value and our reciprocity in the community.
Yeah, one thing that I want to touch on a bit more is actually that value, because I'll bring up my screen here. When we talked to Shaniqua Bowden, and we talk about dollars and inequality, one thing that came up, and what continues inequality is that people aren't earning their value. And you brought up some really great points in that discussion on exactly what is value. You know, is it the product? Is it the people? Is it both? You know, is it the history that those people come from? So I do want to take a slight, you know, detour to just talk about, you know, what is value and how do we tap into, you know, human value, you know, those stories you tell.
Yeah.
Just what do you highlight as value?
Well, I'll just harken back quickly to Monday with Heinz, because he talked about that thing we hear in America a lot, that during World War II in Germany, a whole wheelbarrow full of Deutschmarks couldn't buy you a loaf of bread. And he goes, no, it was worse than that. And I didn't realize that there was truth to this story. Of course, I knew that the Deutschmark fell in value during, especially before World War II, when Germany was very much struggling after World War I. But yeah, suddenly the Deutschmark became so worth nothing that people had to get paid twice a day, because the money that they got in the morning that they then quickly went and got food with was worth less than it was in the afternoon. He said every day the value was dropping so quickly that payday was twice a day. And that was mind blowing for me. That was like, oh, I'd never heard of such a thing, you know? And so, but to bring it back to Shaniqua and the story of value in our communities, the fact that we misunderstand money, I think, makes us feel like we're different, and things are not able to be accessed the same way. And so as we start to shift our perspective about what money is and where value is, then we start realizing, let's make the community garden that brings our community closer together, because the value is the relationships. And the value is me seeing you in the morning and sweeping a sidewalk together and having a conversation. So as we start to reveal value and break away from the idea that we need so much money, then we start to see that abundance. And one thing that's said at the beginning of the slide that you just showed of Shaniqua is managing scarcity. And I had just started learning about this concept, a discussion on things like managing scarcity. If you are in charge, there's this expression that we've heard, you can take that down if you'd like, Julius, that he who controls the money controls the people. And I often will try to use a more gender neutral word, but the fact is throughout history, it's been a he who controls the money, and then he controls the people. So if we don't have an understanding of what our money is, then other people can control it for us and make a perception that there's not enough to go around. And so those people who manage the money can also create a perception of scarcity and say, you know, these people have enough, but these people can't. And we're just sorry that there's not enough to go around. End of story. Instead of highlighting things. This community, like in Japan, each prefecture in the regions of Japan have pride in something they make, like the best paper in the world, the best beef, Kobe beef massaged and taken care of. Like each prefecture has things that they take pride in and exchange between each other. And that creates value where it's like, yes, of course we're all valuable as humans, but I can buy into this idea that Kingston makes great bricks and we will supply the world with those great bricks, you know, that kind of feeling.
Yeah, that was amazing, that quote that you said, who controls the money controls the people. Because it brings me to our conversation that we had, let me pull it up here, about the evolution of currency, and specifically when we talked about who runs the banks, right? We had the idea of that when we created the monetary system, that, you know, there's a bank involved that then, you know, divvies out to the people, or like everything that you do in respect to managing your money runs through the banks. However, as we talked about with dollars and inequality, and I'll circle the conversation back there, is that we see that these banks treat people differently, treat people unequally. So we oftentimes hit a point where we go unbanked or underbanked, you know, and those are topics that we talked about. But can you just talk briefly about what it is to be unbanked or underbanked? and then how through the current, with each individual being looked at as their own bank and given the opportunity to create their own currents in a way by injecting into the market, how we're shifting the value back into the hands of the people.
Mm-hmm. Well, the fun thing is this is definitely a 5 at 5 money talks kind of conversation. And so this is a highlight from this exciting series of talks we had this week. But that's what was exciting about having Tamika Dunkley and Martin Dunkley on as guests, because not only are they local business owners of Seasoned Delicious, but they're nonprofit-minded people who run Seasoned Gives, which pays forward meals and takes care of people and supports people. And so they're very much in support of a community bank, Black-owned bank, because when you create a safe space where people feel welcome and embraced, then you will be less likely to be underbanked or unbanked. Because typically people who don't have a bank account, I said it this week, don't trust the man. If you don't trust the man, in many ways, from the police officers who can murder people, and just recently, you know, and throughout history have murdered Black people and people of color, then of course you're not going to trust the man. And when you relate the bank to forces like the police departments, then you're not going to get a bank account. And sometimes when you have a bank account and share too much information, quote unquote too much, depending on who is looking at it, then you're not going to want to bank with people who are going to send you off, you know, and put you in jail. And so it's so many related topics, because then we're talking about the mass incarceration system, but the underbanked and unbanked don't trust banks. But if you have banks that are trusted and you understand money and the way it circulates through our communities, then a community-owned bank is somewhere we can go to learn and embrace each other, create businesses, learn about social entrepreneurship and supporting the planet and people just as much as profit, embracing place. These are all things that could be done through a bank. And in a way, they're trying. You know, banks actually had to become forced to give money to our communities, but all banks now have grant programs through the, what was it called? It's Community Response Act, I think. All banks have to give back to the communities they're in, whether they're huge and part of the big bailout from 2008, like KeyBank or Chase, or if they're small and community-based, like Bank of Greene County. So they all do give back, but you know, having Tamika and Martin talk about that local bank helps us understand why people are underbanked and unbanked.
Yeah, and I think that pushes us into our conversation that we had just yesterday with some amazing folks. I'll pull up them right now on universal basic income. And we had the amazing opportunity to talk to Assemblyman Ron Kim. We talked to David McCarthy, the co-founder of Hudson Valley Current, and we also talked to a representative from Senator Julia Salazar's office. And one big emphasis that they put on to address people becoming unbanked and underbanked, and a way to retain that value. And for people tuning in, you can always go back to that conversation that we had, and we'll highlight these things for you Monday. But is an inclusive value ledger, and this idea of putting the power of the banks back into the hands of the people. So can you touch a little bit on the inclusive value ledger, but also we can tie that into the civil endowment and the ideas that David McCarthy proposed in that.
Sure. I really enjoy the inclusive value ledger as a concept, and both Assemblyman Kim and Senator Salazar have introduced legislation, and they are now in the process of getting the support to pass it. And it would be a statewide benefits card that anything from Social Security to, if you're a state employee, to WIC, anything that you get from the state would go directly onto a card to prevent predatory lending and extractive places like check cashing, places that take most of your check. And that's one of the major problems with being underbanked. It's like a magnet that sucks money out of our communities because of that extractive middleman. The middleman is trying to take what they can from each check, when we can actually attract that from the extractive model and have it circulating through our community with something like the inclusive value ledger, because then combined with the current, and this is one reason Hudson Valley Current works with Assemblyman Kim and Senator Salazar. We spoke at a press conference that they had in Manhattan recently, because they see the current as a component in this bigger picture of how to lock money into the community, how to retain our value here and watch it circulate. And so that that predatory lending component is kind of part of the extractive methods we see around capitalism and corporate America. And there's a saying I don't think I've shared with you yet, Kevius, but during the American Revolution, we had the separation of church and state. I believe now we need a separation of corporation and state, because even well-meaning banks that are taking fees from me if I go below zero, or charging me interest on my home mortgage, exorbitant interest sometimes, and where it can border on usury, but we have laws against usury, which is exorbitant interest. Then it all becomes extractive, and it feels like, let's retain our value here as a community. Let's understand capital. Let's shift the narrative around our relationship with it. And there's plenty to go around. That's why we like to exchange abundance and resilience.
Yeah, and I'm not, one for quotes usually. I'll usually leave it up to you, but you just made me think of another quote that's called, it goes, "Those who have the least give the most." And I think that's what we're seeing when we're creating a local economy. It's not about, big industries coming in to add or extract value from communities, because they can't go the full extent as locals within a local economy goes. They can't assign that social value, that we talked about, or any of the virtues that we talked about that was introduced by David McCarthy into the system, into the economic system. It's like, and it goes back to this idea that those who have the least give the most, where it takes you to look to your neighbor and look, to the folks in your community, and that should be the source, of your projection. That should be where you get the strength from your economy. And this is all leading up to a greater conversation that we're going to have today at 5 p.m. Don't forget to tune in about CCPP and the way that the current plans to extract value from people, but retain that value within the community. And this idea of putting value back into the hands of the local economy.
And the goal being to become regenerative.
Regenerative. That's a big. That's a big word, and I kind of want to go in on that topic right now. Is what is the idea of regenerative and us shifting from resilient to regenerative? And
Good question. I'm just going to quickly touch on two things before we move on from Martin and Tamika Dunkley. They started a Facebook group called The Circulation of Our Dollar. That is fantastic. I recommend people check it out. And okay, so I made a note here. Okay, remind me of that question you just asked me. Oh, I remember. David created the book Civil Endowment, David McCarthy, I guess, yesterday. And the idea is that there are unique and creative ways to use money to help it build up in an endowment. And an endowment that is large enough to benefit every human on earth means we have the money and the financial structure and the foundation, which will lead us to a discussion on UBI and RRI. We have that foundation as humans to thrive and be okay. Then our lives and our communities will be safer and more successful, because we won't have the poverty that leads to the crime that destroys communities and families. So does that lead us to UBI or somewhere else?
No, you're touching right on topic. It just this general topic of retaining wealth, and current in the Hudson Valley Current's aim to retain wealth, and why we're shifting the narrative from resilient to regenerative, which still embodies the core of resilience, but what is that added level that comes with the idea of regenerative, and why are we pushing more in that direction?
Well, I really enjoyed our discussion about capitalism yesterday with Assemblyman Kim, David. The representative from Senator Salazar's office. We talked about capitalism, and as a serial entrepreneur for most of my life, I've always embraced capitalism because I see it as as a structure and a system to allow individuals to run businesses and create success. But as we talked yesterday, it's so linked to extractive methods that it's great to be able to change your mind and adjust in life, because, maybe I'm not fully supportive of capitalism. I'm supportive of localized production that strengthens communities. Now, whatever ism we can put on that, I am supportive. I'm in support of that. And so again, like we talked about the evolution of currency, we're also evolving the way we work as societies. And so maybe capitalism, a friend of mine, Mike Caslin, and the director of the Global Center for Social Entrepreneurship, says that we can move to capitalism 2.0, I think he calls it, and getting beyond the extractive thinking and having the social entrepreneurship concepts of multiple bottom line. I think the goal is to shift from an extractive mentality in general so that we respect Mother Earth and don't strip mountains for the coal. And we harness the sun so that we have energy that makes sense and is smart growth and wise for the future of humanity and 7 generations forward, So that is regenerative, shifting our way of doing things and hopefully reinventing everything from the fuel in our cars to the computer we're talking on, to be plant-based, like hemp fuels. Anything you can make with petroleum, you can make with hemp oil. Anything you can make with cotton, you can make with hemp. And the sustainability of that plant is an example of being regenerative, because it's also, the roots go so deep in a plant like that they're pulling nutrients up from deep in the earth, and then interplanting with leguminous vegetables like beans, like soybeans, then you're extracting nitrogen from deep down. So now we're talking about ancient wisdom and Native American techniques. And there's so many solutions. We just have to be able to trust each other and embrace them and also evolve. It's about evolution of currency. It's about evolution of politics and community. And that's why I love these conversations.
I think when you talk about evolve and you talk about inclusivity, is that I want to connect the points, because we started this conversation talking about reciprocity, and now we're hitting a conversation on the idea of being regenerative. And, that goes into what we create at the Current in this 300 line of trust, is this idea of reciprocal regenerative income. How is that different from something like a UBI? What is that exactly? What does that encompass?
Well, the 300 current line of trust that every member gets is similar to a line of credit, but it's actually not credit because there's no interest related to it. There's no fees related to it. It's the trust in our community that allows you and me to go to negative 300. So in a way, that is what we've been talking about. A universal basic income could be a reciprocal regenerative income when we start to see the relationship and the push and pull of money. That's where it becomes reciprocal. So right now, if someone signs up to use currents and they go from 0 to negative 300, our team will reach out to them and say, how can we help you get back up to 0 and above 0? And like a wave and a current, the goal of the current is to go above and below 0. And every time I go below 0, I'm creating currents. And when I now attract more currents to me, I'm going above 0. I could go very high and earn thousands of currents, especially if I'm a larger corporation in the area, like let's say Adams Fair Farms or one of our actual members, Hudson Valley Farm Store. They're going to use thousands of currents per month. And so their wave is bigger. But we each have this relationship with each other. And that's why I like working with Dr. Usher, who we'll see at 5 o'clock today, to see those charts and what the current does to our economy. Makes us see waves and makes us see cycles and pools and what she identified as neighborhoods. We've seen 5 to 7 ecosystems develop in the Hudson Valley through the current, where it's like all designers and publishers, farmers and restaurants, care, education, camps. They're revolving around each other. So having that kind of data and knowledge about our community allows us to see, oh, look, no one's making furniture around here, but there's a young woodworker who's looking to open a business. Let's gather around that community member and inspire him or her to open the business, have values that embrace the community, become successful, find the customers, because we see the demand. We match supply with demand.
Yeah, and I'm super excited to talk with Leanne later today at 5 p.m. On exactly those principles and how do we retain that value? How do we inspire people to engage in their local economy? And we'll be discussing CCPP at 5 p.m. today, so don't forget to tune in. And I really, really enjoyed this wrap up. I know we're closing in on time, but we do have our sponsors. Do you want to give a word to the sponsors? I can pull it up.
Yes. Well, what's interesting is we've had so many sponsors over the years, and the ones that I will mention right now are Saunderskill Farms in Accord. Their farm stand is now open. You got to wear a mask and observe social distancing. O Positive created the Kingston Frontline Mental Health Hotline. Here's the number. And Kenco Outfitters over on Route 28 outside of Kingston is an amazing place to shop for clothing, outdoor gear. But over the years, we'll be celebrating our 10-year anniversary of publishing this August. And yeah, we started in 2010 with Country Wisdom News, which was all good news about community, the land, and the home. And 3 or 4 years ago, I donated the for-profit Country Wisdom News to the nonprofit Hudson Valley Current, and now it's called Livelihood News. So we've been publishing good news now for 10 years. And we've had over 100 advertisers in the area. So I'd like to just mention some of our amazing sponsors over the years, like Adams Fairacre Farms and Augustine Nursery, Global Center for Social Entrepreneurship, The Artifact in Poughkeepsie, Community Compost Company, and Hudson Soil. I wish I had a paper near me because there are so many that I'd like to mention. And those are the sponsors and the supporters that allow independent media to flourish. And without independent media, we start to lose the true stories of our community, and we start to see a lack of volunteerism because people start to see that they don't hear about the school board meetings, they don't hear about the fire department, and they don't hear about town board meetings, and they get less engaged. So community newspapers and local publishing is crucial to our communities. And again, that's another component that fits into this bigger picture of how do we thrive as a community. And that's why I'm excited by next year to release a workbook and curriculum called the Economic Resilience Plan. And so we have a lot of work to do before then, but the idea is any community can create a community currency, but a community currency by itself can't do anything. Just like a dollar by itself can't do anything. We need the stores and the support and the community engagement and the local producers, the farms, the restaurants, the ecosystems, and the entrepreneurial spirit to bring it all to life. So who's in? Send me, direct message me. We're gonna start some currencies.
We're gonna get it going. No, so this was an amazing chat, and thank you for everyone that tuned in to Livelihood. And so for the folks who stayed for this whole conversation, we will have a recap on all of the topics that we talked about in this conversation available Monday, 5 p.m. Where you can tune in and see all of the highlights from the 5 at 5 series, including the one later on today at 5 p.m. with Dr. Leanne Isher talking about the CCPP.
And for now, if you'd like to do any reading today or over the weekend, the June issue of Livelihood is up at livelihoodmagazine.org. And if you click here, you'll see every article that's in the June issue. But each month, we feature just a few articles on the cover, including our pollinator, Feed HV. We talk about phase 1 of reopening your business as a female entrepreneur, and also building better systems around COVID, and our typical daddy debrief. So enjoy that, enjoy your reading, and we hope to see you around 5, or you can always watch our videos at our Facebook page, YouTube, or hudsy.tv. Thanks, Kiwis.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.